Let's begin. Welcome to MS66. This is a mini-symposium on new methods in probabilistic and science-guided machine learning. Most of you are familiar with science-guided machine learning, physics-informed neural networks, but just in case that this is a new topic for you, I'm going to very briefly go over the basics, and then we have an excellent lineup of speakers that will go into the details of their research and contributions to this field. So, the idea of physics-informed neural networks is that you have a PDE, possibly with an unknown set of parameters, and so you have some understanding of the governing equations, how the physics of it works. You might have some sparse observations, noisy observations of the solution of this PDE. You might have an idea about the boundary conditions, the initial conditions, and you might be interested in finding solutions that satisfy a number of constraints. I don't know, it can be divergence-free solutions, right? It can be monotonicity, any kind of extra conditions that from an engineering aspect you're interested in. And you want to solve this PDE with a neural network, right? Sometimes you want to find the forward solution. Sometimes you're interested in finding an inverse solution, so the hidden parameters lambda of this PDE. But no matter what the approach, the basic idea is you gather all your knowledge of different things and you put them in a Lagrangian or a sort of a loss function with Lagrange multipliers. You have your data here, you have the residual of the PDE, and you have any kind of constraints, and you gather all of them with different weights and minimize a neural network on this loss function, hoping to get a good balance between fitting all of these constraints. So what are some of the issues and necessities of further development regarding physics-informed neural networks? Well, one thing that we know, and we have already had a number of talks looking at this, we know that pins are data dependent. So although they can work with sparse data, they cannot work without any data unless we come up with better solutions. So they're very dependent on that high quality data. Can we do something about that? And you will hear about developments there. The other thing is the suboptimal solutions. So it can find solutions for you that satisfy, for example, the PDE, but not the boundary conditions well. Some constraints, but some other constraints are left out, right? What can be done about that? The other thing that I'm interested in is uncertainty quantification for these kinds of data-driven models. Can we ask the model to comment on the certainty of prediction? You will hear about new methods of uncertainty quantification that can be applied to training large neural networks. And finally, what are some novel cases? So we have this loss function there. It can solve forward and inverse problems. Can we do more? Can we solve something related but interesting? All right, so I think that's all for the background that I wanted to give you. Now I'm going to talk about my line of research. So I'm Arash Sarshar. This is a collaborative effort with my team at California State University at Long Beach. So I want to talk to you about endowing neural networks with uncertainty quantification, and we'll see what we can do with that. So let me introduce a number of different approaches to uncertainty quantification for neural networks. Well, if you have a neural network, you see it there, right? It has an output, and we can think of that output as a maximum likelihood estimation of some probability density. So when we train neural networks with a loss function such as MSE, in fact, you can prove that what you're doing is finding the mean of the output distribution. You assume that the output of the neural network is Gaussian, and then you write the equations for it, and it basically boils down to MLE. Okay, so if that's the case, can we not add another output variable, such as sigma squared, that produces an estimate of the uncertainty of the neural network. You can do that, and then we have to go back to the equations and see how do we have to update the loss function. If you do that, you will see that, so here is the input, t and x, you get the mean on one side of this output, and you get something that is equivalent to the variance of the predicted solution on the other side of this neural network. And if you work out the formulas, this is called Gaussian negative likelihood training. It almost looks like the MSE, so you can see the MSE term is here. Data minus the prediction of the network is right there, but we have some terms on that variance. So the way to think about this loss function is the loss wants to steer the model away from two edge cases. This part is log of the variance, so what we are saying is the network should move towards certainty, reduce the log variance. And this part is saying the network should not be overconfident, small sigma, when there is a bad fit, right? Does that make sense? That when this term is large, so must be this term. Okay. So that's easy. And also, it stays with the MLE training, which is nice. Another way to approach this is, of course, Bayesian neural networks. So it's an elegant way of thinking about uncertainty for neural networks. We define priors on the weights of a neural network. We assume that our data are samples, and we can have likelihoods. We can write a fully Bayesian approach, and using some variational inference method, you can train the weights to get the posterior distribution of the weights. So you adjust your understanding of what is the distributions of the weights. So one loss function that you can come up with here is, this is elbow, evidence lower bound loss function. The catch is that you have to use complicated machinery to do variational inference. So computationally, it's not very favorable. Okay? The response to this is Monte Carlo dropout. So the idea here is that each time you make a prediction, some of the neurons, some of the outputs of the layers suddenly drop out with a probability p. It's very well used for avoiding overfitting in neural networks, but it can also be used for uncertainty quantification. And another way of thinking about dropout is that it's exactly the same as Bayesian neural networks, but with a specific prior where the weights are drawn from a Bernoulli distribution. So either the weights are W or they're 0, right? Anyway, the nice thing about Monte Carlo dropout is that the loss function goes back to being, it looks like MLE. You can see that negative log likelihood there, and it has an extra term that is basically penalizing how many of the weights are non-zero. It tries to keep the number of non-zero weights small. So this is computationally better than actually doing the variational inference. Let me show you one more way. So deep ensemble neural networks, it's very intuitive. So you don't have one network, you have an ensemble of networks. They can share the same architecture, they can be different. But during the training, and also when you are ready to make predictions, well, you feed the input to all different networks and collect their outputs, and then you can calculate different statistics on the output, right? Very intuitive. And the nice thing about it is, if you don't train different outputs in a coupled way, they are all separate and independent of each other, right? They can even be trained in parallel. Okay, let me just tell you that there are more ways of doing uncertainty quantification, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and move on to what our contribution is. The question that we asked ourselves is, what uncertainty quantification architectures are amenable to scientific machine learning? What is a good architecture in the specific case where we are trying to solve PDEs. In order to explain that, I'm going to start from this data set from this paper, very good paper. So the idea of this data set is it's very simple. It's one-dimensional, so you have on the x-axis you have the inputs, on the y-axis you have the variable you're trying to regress. But the observation noise on the data is different for different x's. So you get large error in some cases, you get small error in other cases. And a good method for uncertainty quantification should be able to capture this dependency of input noise, right? Should understand that not all inputs are the same. Okay, this is called aleatoric uncertainty. It cannot be reduced by training more, because if you go out and put measurements again at a specific point x, the same amount of noise is going to be on your input data, right? On the other hand, there is epistemic uncertainty or model uncertainty. This can be reduced by training or changing the architecture or changing the way that we implement the model. How do we think about that? Well, in this one-dimensional example, it's easy to see that as well. If you partition your data into a yellow training range, and outside of it, the light blue is out of distribution testing. So I'm going to train on the yellow, but maybe test on the blue. Ideally, a good model should predict high uncertainty far away from its training region. Does that make sense? That the more we get away from what the model has seen during its training, my model should be less certain. It should still make a prediction, but the confidence interval should be large. So these are sort of the ideal things that we want to see. Now, I'm going to bring these ideas to scientific machine learning and pins in specific. So we are looking for the same thing. We want to learn the solution of a PDE using a deep neural network architecture. We want to do uncertainty quantification for both aleatoric and model uncertainty. And we would like to learn both the forward and the inverse operators at the same time. In the PDE that I showed you, it was parameterized by lambda, but it also had a solution y. We want to learn both of them in the same computational path, which means that you don't have to train a neural network for the forward solution and a neural network for the inverse separately. Okay, and finally, we want to keep the computational cost of training this relatively low, which means that we want to go back to maximum likelihood training. All right, what have we done? Well, we looked at deep operator networks for this case. Why? Because there is a strong evidence in the literature. So this is part of the Chen and Chen paper on universal approximation theorem for operators that tells you, under certain circumstances, with some regularities, you can approximate operators to a specific architecture called deep operator network with as much accuracy as you want. There's the bound, right? You can make that bound smaller and smaller. This is a nice result, and it also shows the structure of the network that we have to implement to get at least theoretically these results. There is a branch and trunk. I will show that to you in a second. Okay, but how does deep operator network work for us? What are we trying to do? We're trying to do uncertainty quantification at the same time, right? So this is sort of the sketch of it. We have a model PDE. It has differentials, everything. And what we're going to do, we will think of a deep operator network that has an operator defined on time and space, but also is dependent on the unknown parameter of that PDE, lambda. So you want to discover lambda and solve the equation at the same time. So one part of the network will create the forward solution. This is in the literature of deep operator network. This is called branch. The other part is called trunk, and it will create samples from the PDE parameter lambda. This is a nice schematic of what we are doing. On the top, this is the branch network, and as I told you before, what it's going to do is just try to approximate the solution. So that's the forward part. On the bottom, this is called the trunk. We feed it with samples from an easy distribution, uniform or normal, and these samples, through the deep layers, will be transformed into samples from a much more complicated distribution. We are hoping that that distribution is the distribution for the unknown parameter of the PDE lambda, right? So we're going to force these to arrange themselves in a way that fits well with the PDE. Okay, so what does a loss function for this specific architecture look like? Well, if you look at it, let me parse the pieces for you. This part is just the negative log likelihood Gaussian that we have seen before. We still want to capture the input uncertainty. So in order to do that, we still have to do this. This part is the residual, just like pins. So that's where your PDE, the equations, live. But notice that it's also dependent on the unknown parameter of the PDE lambda. So we're going to steal this part, right? What the bottom part of the model thinks is the correct PDE parameter, and bring it to the loss function. And finally, this red part is just log variance of the lambda. Why is it there? Because we don't want this distribution to collapse. So it will keep the model away from predicting very close lambdas and also very distributed lambdas, right? It will keep them at a nice level of separation. All right. How do we test this? Well, I've shown you a one-dimensional data set. I'm going to show you a couple of results on that. But the idea is to keep everything, the comparisons, to keep them fair. So we're going to test a number of different architectures, but the number of free or learnable parameters in all of them are about the same. We try to keep them the same so they're comparable. Also, we run ablation tests. We don't want to get lucky, right? So we run tests independently and we average them so that if we get a good result, we know that it wasn't that lucky run. What are the performance metrics that we are looking at? Obviously, there are the training and test losses, but also in that data set that I showed you, we can ask the model to make a prediction on unseen data, also make a prediction about its confidence interval, and if the actual data point falls into that confidence interval, that's a good thing. So we calculate the percentage of points, unseen data, that actually fall within the confidence interval predicted by the neural network. So these are our performance metrics. Everything else we keep the same for all implementations. What do I mean by that? We are not taking one approach and optimizing the hyperparameters of that specific approach to get the best accuracy out of it. Honestly, that's not a good way of doing things, right? The architecture, the model should be flexible enough that you spend your computational time on learning, not learning the hyperparameters, learning the PDE, right? So we're keeping the learning rate, number of epochs, optimizer, everything else is kept the same. All right, so let me show you some results. If you remember, the first architecture we looked at was just a simple neural network, but we added this variant. As you can see, so this is the result. Between these blue lines is within the training range. Everything outside of it is outside of the training range. So we're testing the model on something that it has never seen before. I mean, we're doing it anyway, but we are testing the model far away from the training range is what I mean. And as you can see, while it's doing a good job here, these uncertainty shades should open up outside of the training range, but it's not. On the other hand, if you look at the ensemble neural network, it's doing a good job outside the training range, but inside, it doesn't understand the aleatoric uncertainty. It shouldn't. This is not an unexpected result. There is no mechanism that captures that in ensemble. All right? Bayesian neural network, this is kind of an odd result. We expected to get a better accuracy from Bayesian neural networks, but we didn't tinker too much with this sampler. So we use an off-the-shelf HMC sampler to do the variational inference for us, and we didn't tinker too much with its parameters. I'm sure that we can get it to do better, but that's not the point. This is not a knock on BNNs. I would even suggest that the more important thing from this slide is it's computationally expensive to run good variational inference. That is the more important point here. All right, Monte Carlo, we expect this behavior of the solution being non-smooth because we are dropping terms in our in the output of our neural network, right? Randomly dropping terms. It's doing good here, and for some reason it's not doing very well there. And finally, I want to show you the architecture that we have. As it should, because it's built to capture both model and aleatoric uncertainty. It's doing good here, where model uncertainty is important. It's doing okay here because the aleatoric uncertainty is important there. All right, let's see some numbers. So I told you we run multiple experiments and we average them. So one way of testing the results is making sure that the results are consistent among different runs. So this plot exactly shows that. The box plot shows how consistent the results among multiple runs with different initial conditions, right? Here, for example, Monte Carlo dropout has a very wide spread, so you can get lucky with it or you cannot. But you can see that simple neural networks and deep operator neural networks have smaller MSE, better fit, and the result is consistent. Final thing about this experiment is, as I've told you, you can calculate the number of data points that fall within the confidence interval predicted by the neural network. So this is a stronger result because we wanted to do UQ. We didn't want a good fit, right? We wanted to do UQ with this. So 89% of data points fall within that predicted confidence interval. And if you want to break down, 85% of those were within the training range. 97% of the outside of training range were also correctly predicted. Now we take this PDE. It has two unknown parameters. Here's the diffusion parameter and the decay factor here. With d and alpha equal to 1, this has a known solution, so now we can test. On the right, you can see what we should get, the exact solution out of this on time and space. And here, you can see samples from the posterior of y learned by the model. Obviously, it looks grainy because at each point, we are working with a slightly different parameter. Remember that at the same time that we're solving the forward operator, we are sampling the parameter of the PD. So each one is a slightly different PD. Well, what good is this? Well, what you can do is look at the histogram of the learned parameter distribution, and you can see that for both the diffusion and the decay rate, it has a mode at 1. Primary mode is at the exact solution. And interestingly, it has a secondary mode. That secondary mode corresponds to fast decay and highly diffusive, right? So you expect to see it there. It's a quickly dying solution. So most of the terms in your loss function go to 0 if you have that. Okay, but if you take the mean or the first mode and plug it back in, you can see that the predicted result is now very good and the error residual is almost 0 except maybe here at the boundaries. We took this two-dimensional example from a paper by Karniadakis, one learnable parameter in the PDE and also observations from the boundary from the right-hand side or forcing term and from the solution itself are noisy. And we only have 100 observations total, right? So that's the setup of the problem. And same result. You can learn the solution. This is still grainy because it's a sample from a distribution. But you can see that the residuals are small. And if you do the same operation of collapsing it to the mode or to the mean, it'll give you a good result. OK, so to conclude, what I've presented is a deep operator network for uncertainty quantifications of pins, things that have a governing equations attached to them. It can learn the forward and image problems from noisy and sparse observations at the same time is the key. Computationally it's efficient because we did not do variational inference, we just found the maximum likelihood estimation way of doing things. So it's almost like you can use gradient descent for this. And it is able to learn multiple solutions with different degrees of accuracy. So here we knew what the exact solution was, right? But in a practical case, you don't know what the exact solution is. You want to have access to multiple candidates for solutions and being able to pick between them. The figure on the right is basically what we're going to do next. We're trying to test this for this in an inverse problem on chaotic flows and see how well it can fare. All right, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.